This is a video guide for the dForceMagnet. If you prefer written tutorials, please see the PDF that is also included with this product. It will contain the same information as this video. This is an overview of the topics which are covered in this user guide. If you're looking for a specific topic, please use the time markers to jump to the spot where this topic is covered. The first topic is about preparing the interface and the scene, so you have all tools on your screen that you're going to need. Then I'll explain how to set up a magnet, and then I'll cover frames and keyframe basics, and if you're familiar with the timeline in that studio, you can skip this chapter. I will also cover some do's and don'ts for zeroing out values if working with a timeline animation. And then I'll cover how to have a magnet active without influencing the fabric for the first part of the simulation, and I'll also show you a handy trick for precise positioning of the magnet. First of all, make sure you have all necessary tabs on your screen. You will need the timeline, which I like to dock here, the tool settings tab, which I dock here, and the simulation settings. The dForce magnets work with dForce items, so I need to make sure I have a dForce item in my scene. I have this fabric plane, which is just a primitive generated with this menu here, so I need to set it up as a dForce item, and I add the dForce modifier for a dynamic surface. If you're using a ready-made dForce item, a clothing item or a hair, then you can skip this step. Now I have to pick the places where I want my magnets to grab the fabric. So first I make sure I have the fabric selected, and I select this tool here, which is the geometry editor, and you can also find it in the menu here in Tools, Geometry Editor. Then I go to my Tool Settings tab, and the Geometry Editor has three different modes, which is polygon, edges and vertices, and we need this one, the third one, the vertex selection mode. And to be able to see what I'm doing, I switch to wire shaded, and I zoom in on my fabric, and now I select one vertex. A vertex is a point like this one, or this one, or this one. I choose this one here, and I go to the library and activate my Create dForce Magnet script. In this dialog, I can choose the orientation, the rotation of the magnet, and this is important when you have a skirt or any other fabric that is hanging down. Then you can adjust the magnet in a way so that it doesn't stick inside the fabric. In this case, the default orientation is fine, and I can also choose the size, and right now size 5 is fine for me. I hit accept. I select the fabric again and move to the other corner. I still have the geometry editor selected, so I click again to select a vertex, and I run the script again. I keep the orientation, and I have a second magnet added to my fabric. Now I'm going to use these magnets to drape the fabric around this cylinder, and I'm using the timeline for this, and As you can see, I've set my timeline to use 60 frames. By default, it loads with a setting of 30. These frames are not seconds. We have this value here, frames per second, and it's set to 30. That means 30 frames are only 1 second. So what I have here is 2 seconds. I recommend using more than 30 frames for a dForce animation with magnets, because when you move a lot of fabric, and this is not exactly tiny, this is 1 meter by 1 meter, the program just needs a bit more time to process the movement. We also need some frames at the end of the animation so the fabric can settle down and drape properly. So trying to achieve all this within 1 second would be asked a bit too much. It does work in many cases, but you get smoother movements and nicer draping when you give it a bit more time. So that's why I'm using 60 frames for this project here. So now I select my first magnet, this one, and I create a keyframe using this symbol here. And I move it to frame 10, and I move the magnet to a different position closer to the cylinder. As soon as you change the position, the rotation or the size of an object, that studio will automatically create a keyframe for you in the timeline. So make sure you are at the correct position in the timeline when you change an object. And the transition between 2 keyframes will be calculated automatically. And I move to frame 20, and I move the magnet again, and again in frame 30. And I also change the height. So when I scrub this slider here, I can check the movement. Make sure that you don't move the magnets through other objects. So I'm moving this around the cylinder, and I make sure it's not going through it. Also, when you wrap objects, when I'm moving this one from this side over here, I need to make sure that it doesn't move through the cylinder and that it doesn't go across the fabric itself. That would make the simulation fail. I want this one to start the movement a bit later. So I move it now in frame 15. And because I forgot to set the keyframe right at the beginning of the animation, it doesn't move. So I put it here because I want it to start later with the movement. And I go here to the Parameters tab. And I go to Restore Selected Items Pose. So that moves it back to its original position. You could also go here to the Parameters tab and set these sliders manually to 0. There is a way to zero a slider in that studio, which is holding down the Alt key and clicking the slider, but this would delete the value for the whole timeline. So when you're doing animations, Do not do this unless you really want to delete this value across the entire animation. Also, when working with dForce magnets, do not use the zero commands from this option menu, these zero selected items. This command would also remove the dForce functionality. You would lose the magnet effect. And also, when you go to restore, use the restore selected items pose. Do not use this one, the restore selected items, because this would switch it back to being visible in the render. In case you've used this or otherwise changed this value for visibility, there is also a preset to make it invisible in the render again. Okay, so I position this. Now I check this to make sure they really move side to side and not through each other. Okay, that seems to work. I have already set up my fabric with a friction set to the lowest possible value so that it doesn't stick to the floor so much, and I have set a low density so it moves more easily. You can find presets for that also in your library. So I go here to my simulation settings, I select simulation, and I make sure I have these settings. Start bones from memorized pose. This could be on or off right now because we have the zero pose right at the beginning of this animation, and we need the animated use timeline play range. And now I hit simulate and the fabric moves. And so, without the help of any additional software, I have draped the fabric inside that studio. Now let's say I want to add a third magnet here to pick up the fabric about in the middle of the animation and move this part a bit more. How can I do this? I go back to the zero state, because you need to add the deformers in the zero pose of each item. So just to find where I want to put my magnet, I'm going to select it here in the draped state. So I switch back to the geometry editor and I pick this vertex here. And I go back to the very first frame and I create another magnet. Now I want this magnet to get active only here in this frame. Now if I had it active right now, it would influence the simulation. So I needed to move with the fabric without doing anything, and then starting its action only here in the middle of the timeline. So I need to find the correct positions for this magnet. I can go by eye, so I move it here. I like to use this universal transformation tool. So I can just estimate where the vertex will be in the course of the animation. Okay, let's zero that. In the very first frame we need it to be on 0 position. Now let's see what happens. Now this is not too bad, but it does influence the fabric. You can see here it causes these folds to appear. It makes another fold here. So it does make a few changes to the fabric. If I don't want that, there is a trick to find the exact precise positions. I zoom in on this magnet. I select the fabric again and I go back to my geometry editor tool. And I switch to the tool settings tab and I go to this first mode, to the polygon selection. And I choose this polygon here. I go to this entry, selection sets, right click, create selection sets from selected, and let's call it helper. And then I use the eye symbol to make that invisible. This doesn't change the surfaces or the geometry in any way, it just makes this little polygon invisible. So this is my marker, because I know the magnet is attached to this edge, to this corner of the polygon. And now I make it invisible and run the simulation. When the magnet is invisible, it will not influence the simulation. Unfortunately, in that studio, you cannot switch the magnets on and off during a simulation. That would be the simplest solution. It's not possible due to a technical limitation, so we need to find a workaround. So this is the simulation as it would look without this magnet active. So I make it visible again, and now I can position it very precisely for each frame. At the beginning of the animation there is usually a lot of movement in the fabric. So the first few frames will need more adjustments than the later ones. So now I have the magnet floating over the fabric. Following this vertex it's attached to without dragging it anywhere. And now when I have reached the moment where I want the magnet to be active, I change its position. If you want to drop the fabric, you have to move the magnet down so the fabric attached to it also moves down. And now let's see what this looks like. So here it picks up the fabric, moves it a bit closer to the cylinder and drops it again. And before you render, make sure you go back to the Tool Settings tab with the Geometry tool selected. Select the fabric and make sure you switch this one on again so you don't have a hole in your fabric. With these simple tricks, you can create complex animations, complex fabric movement, and I wish you lots of fun.